from their perspective, yes, they're weakened, but it's like a temporary setback. And they're facing a historic opportunity on the other side with an administration that they see as one that could deliver and one that can keep the naysayers, the anti-dealers under control. I don't think that they see themselves as weak as perhaps we might have a tendency to see them today. Weakened, yes, but permanently weakened, no.
Welcome to Babel, Translating the Middle East, a podcast from the Middle East program at CSIS. Here on Babel, we take you beyond the headlines to take a closer look at what's happening in the Middle East and why it matters. This week on Babel, I speak with Dina Esfandiary, the Middle East Geoeconomics Lead at Bloomberg. Previously, Dr. Esfandiary served as a senior advisor for the Middle East and North Africa at the International Crisis Group and was a fellow at the Century Foundation. Her research focuses on security in the Persian Gulf and Iran's foreign relations. Together, we discuss why the United States and Iran are negotiating again, how Tehran's position has changed since 2015, and the different strategies both countries are likely to pursue at the negotiating table. Then I continue the conversation with Ninar, Fawal, and Will Todman to discuss how regional and international actors are responding to the ongoing nuclear talks. To translate some of what's happening in the Middle East, this is Babel. Dina Esfandiary, welcome to Babel.
Thank you for having me.
Why do you think the United States and Iran are negotiating now? Are you surprised it's so early in President Trump's term?
I'm not that surprised. President Trump was clear on several things. He was clear that he wanted to diminish U.S. presence in the region, that he wanted to get rid of forever wars. He's also very clear that he's a deal maker and he wants to resolve problems. And the Iran nuclear issue is an enduring problem. It is admittedly a problem that President Trump kind of recreated in his first term when he pulled out of the 2015 nuclear deal a few years later. But he wants to be the man to fix it. So this really is somewhat of a historic opportunity, I think.
Some people have speculated that it's really a consequence of Iran's dire economic straits. It's a consequence of Iran's weakness because of the setbacks dealt to Iranian proxies in the region after the Gaza war. You certainly were paying a lot of attention during the lead up to the JCPOA negotiations in the mid-2010s. How do you compare Iranian strength and weakness now to Iranian strength and weakness in sort of the 2014-2015 period?
For sure, the economic situation is really quite dire. We've had several years of inflation, high unemployment. I mean, none of the economic indicators have been particularly good for Iran. Although news of these talks did lead to a little bit of a rebound of the rial, which is welcome news for Iranians. And then on the security front, yes, Iran has been dealt a blow. It still maintains proxies in the region and they're not going to go anywhere. But Israel's onslaught against some of these groups has paid off. Hezbollah is weakened, Hamas is weakened. And so Iran finds itself in a different situation. And that might make it more amenable to compromises. Having said that, the Iranian leadership really doesn't believe that this is an existential time. I think they think it's more of a time of we need to question our methods, we need to question our presence, we need to question how we're doing things in the region and review it. So there is a bit of a self-assessment going on. But they definitely don't see this as existential. I had a really interesting conversation with an Iranian official who described it to me as we've lost the set, but not the game. And it really shows you how they look at this as a long-term project. And there are natural cycles in this long-term project where they might find themselves ahead and sometimes they'll find themselves weaker. And this is one of those times.
What do you think the key things are that the Iranian side learned from the JCPOA experience? And what do you think the key things are that the U.S. side learned from that experience?
Well, I think if you talk to Iranian officials, the first thing they'll tell you is you can't really trust the U.S. We came to an agreement. We stuck to our end of the bargain. They pulled out. We even stuck to our end of the bargain for a couple of years after the U.S. pulled out. And still, not only did the U.S. pull out and as a result not deliver, But even worse, the Europeans who stayed in the deal couldn't deliver. Interestingly, they don't criticize the Russians and the Chinese in the same manner, but still, they also could not deliver much more as a result of the US pulling out of the deal. So I think that's one of the main lessons. The line that a lot of people were using in the lead up to the 2015 deal when they were saying, we don't trust the Iranians, so we need an agreement where you don't trust, but you verify. Well, I think the Iranian side has learned that you need that too. We don't trust, so find a way to verify. But in their case, it's verify getting sanctions relief. How do you ensure that this time around, when the US promises some kind of relief, and the Iranians will definitely ask for that, how do you ensure that the US will deliver? I think they'll be tougher on that front. On the US side, I think actually they've learned not so much that you can trust the Iranians, but that if you perhaps dangle enough carrots and combine that with enough sticks, then you can get the Iranians to agree to compromises, and you can get the Iranians to implement the compromises that they agree to. And I think that's quite important for the Western world to understand and to see, because there was a tendency to paint the Iranians as a devil that wouldn't listen and wouldn't implement and wouldn't agree to anything. And I think the Iranians have proved that that's not the case. They've also learned, however, that a nuclear deal is a nuclear deal. It won't be a deal that constrains Iran in other manners unless that is also a part of the negotiations. And I'm not sure the Iranians want all of that to be part of the negotiations.
How ambitious do you think the Iranians are willing to be? Is this, in your mind, likely to be a skinny and short-term deal? Or do you think that it could either be more comprehensive or lead to something much more comprehensive?
My instinct would have been to say that I think the Iranians are going to try to make this as short-term and as skinny as possible. In their ideal scenario, you end up with a similar situation to North Korea, what I call the North Korea 2.0, although admittedly there wasn't even a deal then, so it's not exactly the same parallel. But if the Iranians could get away with some broad promises of compromise and rolling back their program in exchange for sitting in front of the cameras with Trump, then I think that that is something that they've now accepted they would be willing to do, which back in 2018 or in the lead up to 2018 was definitely not something the Iranians were willing to do. But there have been statements coming out of Iran that says that they're willing to talk about things like Iran's regional presence, which honestly surprised me. At the time, the Iranians were helping out, or at least playing a constructive role in pushing back ISIS in the region. The Iranian negotiators were adamant that they wanted to keep the nuclear separate from everything else, even though it was in their interest to include it. This time around, they've actually said they may be willing to talk about their regional presence, which I find very interesting. So that does demonstrate that there may be a willingness to go for a longer-term, larger deal that covers multiple aspects of Iran's problematic behavior, which I honestly thought was not something Iran was willing to do.
If you had to guess what either the secret ingredient would be that would help an agreement come together, or the hidden pitfall that would undermine an agreement, even if they came close, what should we be looking for as the sort of decider of success or failure here?
The secret ingredient is the very thing that overturned the last deal. And I think that that's President Trump and his way of conducting business, and the fact that he sits within the Republican Party, that was the party that was anti-deal last time around. So I think the sense that they could be responsible for a new deal actually will help make it succeed. There are still a lot of people in the US system, you know better than I do, that are anti-deal and that are very vocal about being anti-deal. But it's a lot harder to be anti-deal under Trump when Trump is leading the deal making. People are a lot more nervous about it. And he's, I think, better at ignoring the criticism that is thrown his way. It kind of gets lost in all the noise at the moment anyway. So I do think that actually he is part of what could make this successful for as long as the Iranians understand that and recognize that. And I think increasingly they do. What could possibly derail this entire thing? Well, there are several things. I think the first country that could derail these talks is Israel. The Israelis have made it very clear that they don't want a deal. They don't want to be constrained by a deal that Trump signs onto, because that means Israel can't then go and target Iranian nuclear facilities militarily, which is what the Prime Minister of Israel, Netanyahu, has said he would like to do. The only deal that's acceptable to them is one that completely dismantles Iran's nuclear program, which is a non-starter for the Iranian side. So I think they're a huge and scary spoiler. I do, however, think that it's a spoiler that President Trump can manage. The relationship between Trump and Netanyahu is not as smooth as perhaps Netanyahu's relationship with others. So at least on the Iran file, I think this is something that he can manage. Other spoilers, I think, include things like domestic politics in the US and domestic politics in Iran. Oddly enough, they mirror each other. There are many people in both countries that don't want a deal to happen. Many Iranians that don't want to be talking to the Americans, and many Americans that don't want to be talking to the Iranians. So that, again, is a bit of a risky spoiler. I think Iran's partners in the region could also play the role of a spoiler. While, as we said at the beginning, they've been weakened, they are not all on board with either following Iran's instructions, because they have different relationships with Tehran and they don't necessarily do what Tehran tells them to do, but also they don't want de-escalation. So if you look at, for example, the Houthis, the group in Yemen that has been very active in the Red Sea, well, it doesn't matter if Iran suddenly turns around and tells them, look, we're dealing with the Trump administration, lessen your attacks. If they believe there's a reason for them to pursue those attacks, they will pursue them. And that can also derail the talks.
And interestingly, you've spent a lot of time understanding where the Gulf Arab states are, and they were very, very skeptical of the deal in 2014, 2015. And now they seem, if not very much in favor, at least open to it. But it seems it might even be crossing the line into supportive, no?
Absolutely. That is, in fact, one of the big differences between the lead up to the 2015 deal and today. Is the Gulf Arab states were the potential spoilers back then. They didn't want a deal. They supported Trump's maximum pressure campaign after the deal was signed, and they supported Trump pulling out of it. We are in a completely different world today when it comes to the Gulf Arab states. Saudi Arabia and the UAE have largely normalized with Iran. They have a cordial, sustained dialogue where they have been de-escalating with Iran. They find themselves in a situation today while they want to contain Iran's nuclear program, they want to contain Iran's presence in the region, they also believe that they should do it through dialogue and direct de-escalation, which they're pursuing themselves. So they don't want the Trump administration and its allies to do anything that could derail this conversation that they now have going with Iran. They're worried about being caught in the middle if there is some kind of military attack against Iran. So they're kind of walking a fine line and trying to balance in the middle and trying to ensure that this leads to a deal so that things don't escalate in the region.
You've known a lot of Iranian negotiators. I'm not sure if you know folks on the U.S. negotiating team, at least this time around. How do you judge the strengths and weaknesses of the U.S. and Iranian negotiating teams going into these talks?
Well, the Iranian negotiators this time around are the same negotiators as last time around. So they're seasoned negotiators. They've done this for a while. They know what to look for. They know what to ignore. They know what the Americans can actually deliver on and what they can't deliver on. They've learned all of that from the last round of negotiations. So they're very well placed to conduct these negotiations. On the US side, the team is new. Steve Witkoff is new to these kinds of negotiations. I mean, I'm sure he's done many real estate negotiations and many fruitful ones, but it's not quite the same. He will bring a fresh perspective, but he won't have the experience that the Iranian side has. And the same could be said on the technical level. My worry is that on the US side, the teams are not as well staffed as they have been in the past. And again, they'll be facing an Iranian side who's done this before. It's not their first rodeo, so they know what to do. And I think that will make the Iranians somewhat more comfortable. I'm not sure it will make much of a difference in the negotiations, but I do think the Iranians will be going in knowing what they can ask, what's worth pushing on, and what's not worth pushing on.
Is there a role for Europe in these negotiations, either vis-a-vis the Trump administration, vis-a-vis the Iranians, or does Europe have somewhat strained relations with both at this point?
As someone who sits in Europe, I want to be able to say there's a big role for Europe to play. But I think today there isn't. I think the Europeans were absolutely key to the negotiation of the first nuclear deal. But they were disappointing when it came to the implementation of the deal once the US was no longer a member or a party to the deal. I think they've strained relations with both sides, and certainly the Iranians don't really see them as trustworthy anymore. They don't think they can deliver. They don't see the point in engaging with the Europeans separately, although they did do it for several weeks a few months ago. And they've actually been quite good at ensuring that the Europeans are kept in the loop, as is the American side, I'm sure. But there isn't that level of trust in the Europeans and their ability to deliver, and in making engaging with them worth it on the Iranian side, basically. So they've really focused all their efforts on the Trump administration because they think that the only person who can deliver today is Trump. And if Trump signs on, then the Europeans will basically have to get on board. Now, the only place where the Iranians are kind of watching the Europeans with a little bit of nervousness is this October deadline that we have coming up this October, with the date at which Iran's nuclear program is supposed to have been normalized had things gone as planned. This is effectively the last date where the Europeans can trigger snapback sanctions, which was that mechanism that was in the nuclear deal that allowed them to basically punish countries that didn't implement the deal. There is a little bit of worry on both sides, on the Iranian side, but even on the European side, about whether they should go for that, shouldn't go for that. How long do they wait to see whether the negotiations between the US and Iran, where they go and whether they lead to anything before they trigger it, because I think there's a 90-day window, so they would have to trigger it over the summer. So there's a little bit of anxiety and stress, I think, on all sides about what Europe might do if these talks don't go anywhere, or actually conversely, if they do go somewhere, but it's not good enough for Europe.
Is there a Chinese and Russian role in any of this, either in helping bring this together, or do you think they'll try in some ways to break things apart?
The Russians and the Chinese this entire time have played a really interesting role. In the lead up to the first deal, despite the fact that they sometimes didn't see eye to eye with the Americans or with others on a range of issues, they did manage to maintain a unified front when it came to negotiating on Iran's nuclear program and really ensuring that Iran wouldn't become a nuclear weapon state. I think the Russians and the Chinese still would rather Iran not become a nuclear weapon state. I think that they don't want proliferation of nuclear weapons. And so as a result, they are supportive of these negotiations. They are less unified with the US and with American allies for a range of obvious reasons, and not all of them are related to the nuclear negotiations, but they're also less unified because they see the same thing that the Iranians saw, which is that there was a deal, it was working, and it was the US that pulled out and reimposed sanctions on Iran. So they're a bit wary of the whole process, as it were. Having said that, like I said, I think they've been supportive of the negotiations. There has been a lot of conversations between the Iranians and the Chinese and the Iranians and the Russians, both keeping them in the loop, but also just discussing what a new nuclear deal could look like. And I think that's broadly positive. The kind of negative role that they play, though, is that they do provide Iran with a backup. Again, this isn't a few years ago. Today, Iran has really built its ties with the Russians and the Chinese. Would it prefer to be Western-facing? Perhaps, but it can't afford to ignore the Russians and the Chinese. And so their relationship has really grown on multiple levels, from the economic to the political to the military. And should these talks not work out, Iran can continue to rely on the Russians and Chinese. And so that means that Iran won't be as adamant or as desperate. I don't like using the word desperate, but as desperate for a deal.
But it seems to me that in a broader sense, Iran enters these negotiations with a looming secular decline. You have the weakening economy, you have the energy transition, you have what is likely to be a somewhat messy leadership transition as Ayatollah Khamenei, now in his mid-80s and ailing, leaves the scene. The Revolutionary Guard may take a different role in domestic politics, and an even more overt role But it feels to me that if you're betting on Iran in the next 5 years or so, it's hard to be very confident about Iran's prospects. I would imagine both from an Iranian negotiating position on this nuclear deal, but also in terms of the way other great powers see the Iranians, that the Iranians are in a somewhat diminished position, and one that's going to get worse, not better. A, do you agree with that analysis? And B, how does that affect this issue of the negotiations, how long they'll last, and what kinds of outcomes we'll get?
I do agree. I do think that Iran is somewhat weakened compared to a few years ago, as we said earlier. We talked about the regional factor, but you mentioned another one that's key is the leadership transition. The supreme leader is getting old. There will come a time where they will have to think about another supreme leader. And that, I think, is going to be the single most important event that today's Islamic Republic will face. How they manage that transition, who comes in its place. It will determine what direction the Islamic Republic goes in, whether it will be more open, whether it will be more closed, whether ideology will be a big factor or not. All of those things will be determined by the process of agreeing on a new supreme leader and who that new supreme leader will be. So I think it will be a huge moment for the Islamic Republic. And so they know that this is coming up, which is why I would argue up until October 7th, they were really trying to keep all fronts as quiet as possible because it was going to be an all hands on deck moment. And now they're spread thin. They're not as confident in the region. Economically, they're not doing as well. And so all of this puts them in an uncomfortable position. It puts them in an odd place. But I don't think all Iranian officials agree with me. And I think what matters more is not so much what I think, but how they view their situation. I think they see themselves, yes, as weakened, but as I said earlier, for them it's cyclical. The Islamic Republic doesn't work in 4-year election cycles. It isn't split into two opposing parties that are at each other's throats all the times. They see these things and the infighting and the ups and downs as completely normal. They think, yes, their proxies in the region have been weakened, but their relationship with these proxies are relationships that ebb and flow and go up and down. And some of these proxies, their ideology is going to endure, if not harden, as a result of everything that's happening in the region. And so potentially down the line, it can be another success. They really see things very differently to the way that we see them. And they see the relationship that they've built with the Russians and the Chinese. And do they want to be only reliant on them? No, absolutely not. But do they offer them a pretty decent backup in today's world? If things don't work out with the Americans and the Europeans, they think, sure, it's something that they can manage. They've built up what they call their idea of resistance economy. They are the economy is doing poorly, but the diversity in the economy is probably better now than it was a few years ago. So from their perspective, yes, they're weakened, but it's like a temporary setback. And they're facing a historic opportunity on the other side with an administration who is an administration that they see as one that could deliver and one that can keep the naysayers, the anti-dealers under control. I don't think that they see themselves as weak as perhaps we might have a tendency to see them today. Weakened, yes, but permanently weakened, no.
You know better than I do, the Iranians are often very patient in negotiations, and this is a unprecedentedly impatient U.S. administration. How do you think that will play out in these negotiations? Do you think ultimately the president's impatience will win the day and he'll be able to create a sense of urgency? Or would you expect the Iranians will take this longer view, a cyclical view, and say, well, if we don't get it this time around, there'll always be next time?
That's a really good question. I'm torn. I'm torn because I think the Iranians, yes, they like longer negotiations. They have an interest in dragging these ones out as they have past negotiations. The more time they can buy themselves, the better it is. Also because I don't think they're very good at committing to things quickly. It's just not in the way that they do things. Having said that, the flip side of that is that an impatient president might mean a president that's willing to also concede on more. So I think the Iranians aren't sure where they sit. Basically, I think the middle ground would be not good for them, but they either play the very long game and get away with it, or they try to maximize this urgency that they're facing right now and try to get as much as possible from a US administration. I think they're probably trying to do both, which doesn't necessarily work, because how do you go for a quick deal if you're also aiming for a longer one? But I just think they're at a stage where they're exploring, they're being pretty, as far as I understand it, pretty clear about what they can agree to and what they can't agree to, in a way that perhaps in the past they weren't as clear on. And there was a lot of back and forth in the lead up to the 2015 deal, with the supreme leader setting red lines, the Iranian negotiators blowing past them, then coming back. It was a horrific back and forth dance that I think everybody was tired of, which I don't think you're seeing this time around, at least not so far in the 3 rounds of talks that we've had. It's progressed relatively quickly. Now it will really just be a question of, are you going to be able to hash out the real technical details in a way that's satisfactory to both sides in Trump's 2-month timeframe? And I think the Iranians are going to try, all the while having as a backup their long-term plan. I don't know how that's going to work out, though.
We will have to catch up with you again. Dina Esfandiary, thank you very much for joining us on Babel.
Thank you so much for having me.
Dr. Esfandiary says that Gulf states are walking a fine line with these negotiations. Jon, Will, how do you think Gulf states will react to possibly failed negotiations, or maybe an Israeli attack on Iranian nuclear facilities?
I think they start from the position that they're a little uncomfortable. Successful negotiations put them at some risk, and they really need a U.S. security umbrella to keep them safe. But failed negotiations also put them at risk, which makes them feel they need a U.S. security umbrella. I don't think that any of them are in the mood for an Israeli strike. They think they will bear the consequences of that. But I think they would like the Iranians to feel there's the prospect of a strike, because in the Gulf sense, that will move the Iranians along toward making some sort of agreement. But ultimately, as I said, the Gulf states feel they need the U.S. to stay engaged. Maybe the best way to get the U.S. engaged in the long term in the Middle East is to make the U.S. feel some sense of responsibility for a nuclear deal.
On your question about how they would respond to an Israeli strike, it partly depends on how that strike was conducted, or strikes plural. Did Israeli jets use Gulf Arab airspace? Did they work in coordination with US troops who are stationed in the Gulf? Was there any kind of intelligence sharing? I think the degree to which Arab Gulf states were involved to some degree in that would shape the outcome and would shape the likely response from Iran. Certainly, as Jon said, I think they would be very likely to push for an increase in defense support from the US, increased military presence in the region. But I think publicly they would be likely to call for de-escalation. Probably they would vary a little bit in how critical they were of it. I would expect a state like Qatar to be more openly critical of an Israeli strike, whereas other states like Saudi Arabia and the UAE would probably limit their public statements to calls for de-escalation. Ultimately, though, I do think they would be very concerned about Iran's response, but then seek to return to essentially the status quo now, where they have some relations with Iran. They are able to engage with Iran on certain issues. We've seen a flurry of diplomatic activity and visits over the last few weeks. And I think now, generally speaking, Arab Gulf states realize that they need to have those relations with Iran to allow them to advance their economic plans for the region, which depend on stability. And so I think that's quite a big difference, as Dr. Esfandiary said, and you said, Jon, from the situation in 2015 during the JCPOA talks.
My understanding from people who've thought through the military aspects of this is an Israeli strike on the Iranian nuclear program would not be a single event. It would be preceded by Israel degrading Iran's air defenses. That would likely require multiple sorties over time, partly because some of their air defenses are mobile. And so this issue of what are the Gulf Arab states doing? What is the United States doing? It's not what do you do in the instant. It's what do you do over a series of days? And I think that makes it a little harder for some of the Gulf states to be quite as neutral as they might like to be, because they'll be implicated one way or the other over days.
Now, on the Israeli side of things, why has Israel's calculus on Iran differed?
So I think Israel sees Iran quite differently at the moment. On one hand, it views Iran as the weakest it has been in the region after degrading Hezbollah, after the fall of Bashar al-Assad in Syria, with ramped up US strikes against the Houthis. Sort of across the region, Iran is certainly in a much weaker position. But at the same time, I think Israel is genuinely very concerned about the progress Iran has made towards a nuclear weapon. Now, Iran has enriched uranium over 60%. It is much closer than it's ever been to that point. And I think that is really a concern for Israel, and they believe that the best option is to strike directly. And I should say as well that their rhetoric has changed quite a lot. Back in 2015, it was much more about cyber attacks or sabotage. Now, Israel is talking much more openly about striking directly on Iran. So I think on one hand, they are keen to press for their advantage when they see Iran as being weaker. But I think they're also even more concerned about the threat that Iran could place to them. And that means that they want the talks to be much more expansive, and they want the US to push for greater concessions from Iran. Benjamin Netanyahu keeps talking about a Libya-style deal that would see a total dismantlement of Iran's nuclear program. He wants the ballistic missiles program to be part of talks, probably wants Iran's support for partners and proxies in the region to be included in this as well. And I think Israel seems really quite concerned about some of the noises coming out of the White House, and particularly from President Trump, that express openness to a deal that could end up looking more like a JCPOA type agreement that limits but doesn't completely dismantle Iran's nuclear program. And I would also say that I think Israel's in a different space in terms of the leverage it feels over the US and over regional actors at this point. Back in 2015, it was easy for Netanyahu to appeal to Republicans in the US who really were not supportive of President Obama's efforts at all. Now he's dealing with a Republican president who is leading these negotiations, and so I think feels that there's perhaps less space to maneuver in the US political sphere. While also Gulf states that were previously against these talks are now expressing much more openness to the talks and openly supportive of the talks. So I think it's a really complicated situation for Israel where on one hand, they feel even more threat than before. On the other hand, they do think that this is the time to press ahead with the advantage and get more concessions.
And I think there are two other elements. One is that Israelis across the political spectrum see the October 7th 2023 attacks as the finger of Iran. It was not Iranian action. The Iranians weren't tactically behind it, but strategically, they see that connected to Iran's regional strategy, and they feel they have to deal with that decisively because that was by far the most traumatic thing that's happened in Israel's modern history. The other piece is that for the last year, all the big gambles that Netanyahu has taken arguably have paid off, from assassinations, from taking out Hezbollah in Lebanon, from defying the United States and defying the Biden administration. I think there's a way in which the Israeli government feels that not only is now a good time to take risks, but being less risk averse has resulted in Israel being in a stronger position vis-a-vis its regional adversaries than any time in the past. And I think that even when you have risk-averse politicians like Benjamin Netanyahu, now may be the time to push forward, to push for advantage, to lock in advantage from Iran's weakness. Because if you miss this opportunity, a similar one may not come along for generations.
Well, coming back to these negotiations, how do you think it will affect Iranian proxies and their activities?
Well, it depends which proxies we're talking about. The Houthis seem somewhat protected from influence either of the Iranians trying to hold them back or the U.S. trying to beat them back. I'm not sure that the Iranians either would seek to really rein in the Houthis or that they would be successful necessarily reining in the Houthis. Hezbollah has a real problem. They have a big supply problem, made much, much worse by losing Syria as a supply chain. Proxies in Iraq are less secure than they've been. The tide seems to be shifting against them, but I don't think they're as weakened as Hezbollah in Lebanon has been. Other proxies are less important, proxies like Islamic Jihad in Gaza, which I haven't heard from recently. But from an Iranian perspective, what is so striking is how just about a year ago, when President Raisi died in the helicopter crash, it felt to me like Iran's strategy of using proxies, of facing toward Asia and spending less time paying attention to the United States was paying off. And now it looks like Iranian policy is in complete disarray. As Dina said, they see that as temporary and not permanent, but it certainly presents a more promising environment for negotiations from a U.S. perspective than during the Raisi presidency, where I think the Biden team wanted to negotiate with the Iranians and couldn't find a partner on the other side.
Yeah, I agree with you, John, that I think this looks really different for the different partners and proxies that Iran has across the region. On Hezbollah, I agree with you. I think that it's now gone to ground. I think it's trying to have quiet so that it can slowly rebuild. And I think Hezbollah probably would be quite happy to see a deal that leads to de-escalation in the region and that perhaps constrains Israel's ability to conduct additional strikes across the region, if we get to that place where the Iran deal does end up having a regional dimension as well. It also might benefit if there is sanctions relief on Iran and Iran's economy has a kind of boost from this, then Hezbollah could ultimately benefit from that, given its reliance on Iran. I think for the PMF and for other Iraqi militias, I think they're probably looking at this with much greater concern that they could be included in a larger regional deal that could really constrain their ability to operate. So I think these look quite differently. And one of the sort of issues is that so often people lump all of these different groups together when actually they have really different incentives, methods of acting and whatnot. But I think there would be quite real divergences.
The other piece to keep in mind is, what does success look like? And I think people in the Middle East have often accused the United States of thinking success means the problem goes away, when from the view of leaders in the Middle East, the problems never go away. You get advantage, you can treat problems, but issues like Iranian ambitions on the Arabian shores of the Gulf, from a Gulf Arab perspective, is permanent, not temporary, and there's no deal that will change it. I think in this case, the Israelis, who've often accused the United States of being naive about the ability to actually solve problems, seem keen to solve the Iranian problem, where I would argue that both the Gulf Arab states and maybe even the Trump administration don't think you're going to solve the problem of Iranian aggression, but you're going to treat it and make it better. I think it's an interesting shift in perspective. And of course, the fear of some people on both the Gulf Arab side and on the U.S. side, although I'm not sure in the Trump administration, a fear that attacking Iran may actually accelerate Iran's move toward having a nuclear weapons deterrent, which, while it might make things better in a year or two, in a 5-year time frame, could make things much worse.
Well, you mentioned the concept of a larger regional deal. Dr. Esfandiary also differentiates that from what she calls a quote-unquote short-term deal. What do you think could be the effects of both?
So a short-term deal would be much easier to reach. It would probably include temporary restrictions on aspects of Iran's nuclear program that might include uranium enrichment, stockpiles, things like that. Probably also limited sanctions relief. And I think the aim would really be to buy time for a broader agreement that would encompass a much broader range of issues. And given the timelines that President Trump has set out for how quickly he would like to see a deal, and given the timeline coming up that Dr. Esfandiary mentioned about the snapback sanctions from Europe in October, I think it's likely that if these talks are successful, I think they're likely to lead to a shorter-term interim deal in the first place that could then allow space to talk about these more difficult issues. A comprehensive deal would very likely include broader sanctions relief, perhaps lifting of secondary sanctions to allow other actors to engage economically in Iran. It could involve discussion of Iran's ballistic missile program. It could include aspects of its support for these partners that we've been talking about across the region. And a lot of these issues are going to be a lot harder. And so the idea of a deal on that in the next, month or so, I find very, very hard to believe. So I think an interim deal would allow the Trump administration to say that it's had a win, that its pressure has resulted in temporary concessions from Iran. And then we would see, does the Trump administration really have the patience and the political will to engage in talks about these much broader issues? Certainly, the Iranians keep talking about the $1 trillion opportunities that exist in Iran in terms of investment and trade and whatnot. I find that harder to believe that we will see real investment, certainly from the US in Iran, anytime soon. But the idea of broader talks is that some of these issues could be on the table.
And it feels to me like that's the challenge, a pacing challenge. The Iranians have an instinct to go slowly. The Trump administration has an instinct to go quickly. What kinds of tensions that will create? Will the Trump administration be able to create that urgency? Will the Iranians feel they're losing a window of opportunity? I'm not sure how that plays out. I think that issue is one where Steve Witkoff's negotiating experience may come in handy. The challenge is it's just so technical that sorting through the technical issues and making sure you understand what is actually meant by all the different clauses. I have to give the advantage to the Iranian negotiators because after all, they've been doing this for 20 or 30 years.
Jon, Will, thank you very much.
Thank you, Ninar.
Thank you.
Thanks for listening to Babel. If you enjoyed this episode, please subscribe to the podcast on iTunes or Spotify or wherever you listen to podcasts. You can find more analysis on this topic linked in the show notes on the CSIS website, and you can find us on Twitter at CSIS Mideast.